March 1943. The North Atlantic was a graveyard of steel and silence. Convoy HX 229, 49 merchant ships carrying fuel, food, and ammunition, set sail from New York bound for Liverpool. Their mission was simple but perilous: cross the most dangerous stretch of ocean in the world. Few who boarded those ships could have known they were sailing straight into one of the deadliest U-boat ambushes of the war. The Allied war machine depended on these convoys. Every can of fuel, every crate of bullets, every ton of food sustained Britain's survival. But the German Kriegsmarine knew that as well. Beneath the waves, Admiral Karl Donit's U-boats prowled in deadly packs, wolf packs, ready to strike. By 1943, they had already sent more than 1,000 Allied ships to the bottom. The men aboard HX 229 knew the odds were against them. The convoy was escorted by a mixed British and American screen. The destroyers HMS Duncan, HMS Vimy, and USS Upshur, along with corvettes Pennawort and Dianthus. These small ships bristled with depth charges and sonar gear, but their crews were exhausted. Escort duty meant constant alert. Every sonar ping a possible death sentence. For 7 days, the convoy fought the Atlantic's wrath. Mountainous seas, freezing spray, and the constant dread of unseen hunters below. On the night of March 15th, an eerie calm settled over the convoy. The wind dropped. Visibility worsened. Somewhere out in the darkness, 30 U-boats, Group Robgraf, were converging, directed by encrypted German signals the Allies could no longer read. Bletchley Park's codebreakers had lost access to the new Triton cipher just weeks earlier, leaving convoys like HX 229 blind. One British officer later recalled, "We were sailing through the dark without eyes." In the convoy, discipline strained under exhaustion. Merchant captains fought to hold formation, their ships creaking under cargo and storm. At dusk, one vessel, the Narva, carrying aviation fuel, reported radar interference, strange static that jammed their sets. Moments later, lookouts aboard HMS Duncan sighted red flares to starboard, distress signals from the freighter Empire trader. Within minutes, explosions ripped through the night. German U-boats had struck. Torpedoes slammed into the lead ships, their impact echoing across the convoy. Flames illuminated the waves as men scrambled for lifeboats in freezing water. The escorts retaliated immediately, launching depth charges, their detonations lighting the sea in sickly green bursts. But for every explosion, another Allied ship was hit. Radio transmissions became chaos, fragmented maydays, confused orders, and static. By dawn, the ocean was littered with debris. The Narva was gone. The Port Auckland was aflame. HMS Vimy picked up 27 survivors, many half dead from exposure. The convoy scattered in panic, each captain steering desperately to avoid the burning hulks and unseen submarines below. The North Atlantic had become a battlefield and a grave. In his diary, Lieutenant Harold Fraser of the Duncan wrote, "We could see nothing, only hear the screams in the water. The sea was boiling with torpedoes. Men clung to planks, their eyes wide with fear. You could taste the oil on the wind." That night's engagement was one of the most brutal of the Atlantic campaign. Yet amid the destruction, something strange occurred. When roll call came the next morning, 7 ships were unaccounted for. Not sunk, not adrift, simply gone. No distress signals, no debris fields, no survivors. They had vanished from radio contact entirely. At first, officers assumed the chaos of battle had caused misreporting. But when search aircraft from Iceland scoured the convoy's projected path, they found nothing. No lifeboats, no oil slicks. The official report listed the ships as cause unknown. Even today, that phrase chills naval historians, because in a war meticulously documented, such absences are rare and deeply unsettling. The loss of HX 229 shocked Allied command. The convoy's destruction, combined with that of SC 122, represented the worst single defeat of the Atlantic campaign. Yet even in the aftermath, questions lingered. How had the U-boats found them so easily? Why had the escort's radar failed? And where had those 7 ships gone? For the men who survived, there was no answer. Only the memory of burning seas and vanishing comrades. As one survivor put it, the Atlantic keeps its secrets. As the battered remnants of HX 229 limped toward Britain, intelligence officers in London began piecing together the fragments: stray radio signals, distorted compass readings, and whispered reports from the survivors. Something about this convoy didn't fit the usual pattern of attack. The official record would close the chapter with a line of bureaucratic calm: lost at sea, presumed sunk by enemy action. But for those who had been there, and for those who would later investigate, it was the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the Atlantic for decades. And somewhere out there, beneath the cold, endless gray, the lost ships of Convoy HX 229 still rest, silent witnesses to a secret the ocean has never revealed. In the aftermath of Convoy HX 229's devastation, the North Atlantic seemed to hold its breath. The British Admiralty, shaken by the scale of the losses, demanded answers. How had the Germans known the convoy's precise route and timing? The U-boats had struck with uncanny coordination, as though guided by an unseen hand. For the first time in months, even the seasoned officers at Western Approaches Command in Liverpool began to suspect a terrifying possibility: that the Allies had lost their invisible edge. Since 1941, British intelligence at Bletchley Park had been intercepting and decoding German naval communications under the top-secret Ultra program. These intercepts had saved hundreds of ships by revealing U-boat positions days in advance. But by early 1943, something had changed. The German Navy introduced a new cipher system, the Triton, or Shark Key, used exclusively for U-boats operating in the Atlantic. Overnight, the British were blind. Their ability to read Donit's orders evaporated, and with it, the security of every convoy crossing the ocean. Without those decrypts, Admiral Sir Max Horton could do little more than rely on guesswork and radar plots from overworked escort commanders. It was a desperate situation. Horton later wrote, "We were fighting a battle in the dark, and the enemy knew it." German Admiral Karl Donitz, meanwhile, sensed his moment. He deployed 30 submarines, Wolfpack Robgraf, or Robber Baron, to converge on the Mid-Atlantic Gap, an area beyond air cover where the convoys were most vulnerable. In a cold bunker outside Lorient, France, Donit's staff studied intercepted Allied convoy schedules and weather reports. Using long-range Enigma-encoded transmissions, they choreographed a deadly ambush with military precision. Every U-boat was ordered to remain radio silent until visual contact. Donit's philosophy was simple: strike not where they are strongest, but where they must pass. The Convoy HX 229 was his perfect target. Back in Britain, the intelligence officers of Bletchley Park worked around the clock, trying to break the new cipher. Codebreakers like Alan Turing and his team at HUD 8 had seen this pattern before. The Germans periodically updated their encryption keys. But Triton used an entirely new set of indicator groups and message formats. The mechanical bombs could not keep up. As one operator lamented in her diary, "We knew something terrible was happening out there, and we were powerless to stop it." While cryptographers battled paper and rotors, sailors battled the sea itself. On board HMS Duncan, Captain Peter Gretton struggled to hold his exhausted men together. Days blurred into nights filled with sonar pings, depth-charge detonations, and ghostly echoes in the fog. Every contact was a phantom, one sonar operator recalled. You never knew if it was a whale, a wreck, or death itself waiting below. The stress was relentless. Crews rotated on 4-hour shifts, barely sleeping, their nerves frayed by caffeine and adrenaline. The strain of command was equally brutal. Gretton's standing orders required him to protect the merchantmen at all costs. But how do you guard what you cannot see? With broken radar and no air support, his escorts were groping through darkness. On March 16th, a garbled radio message reached him from a merchant vessel on the convoy's flank. Enemy shadowing. Bearings uncertain. Then silence. The ship never reported again. In London, analysts compared fragments of Allied and Axis transmissions, hoping to reconstruct what had gone wrong. One decrypted German weather report, sent just hours before the attack, mentioned a special operation by Robgraf, an unusual phrase that raised eyebrows. Could the Germans have developed a new method of tracking convoys, perhaps by exploiting Allied radio chatter or radar signals? The Admiralty dismissed the theory as speculation, but the timing was too perfect to ignore. Weeks later, a captured U-boat officer hinted at something chilling. During interrogation, he claimed his group had used electronic ghosts, false radio beacons, to lure convoys off their intended course. The claim was noted and then buried, considered wartime boasting. But decades later, declassified intelligence confirmed that in early 1943, the Germans experimented with radar decoys and directional jamming designed to mislead Allied navigators. The seed of a mystery had been planted. For the men of HX 229, the consequences were immediate and brutal. With the codebreakers blind and the escorts overwhelmed, the convoy was left exposed to the most ferocious wolf pack assault of the war. Between March 16th and 19th, 21 merchant ships were sunk, over 100,000 tons of vital cargo lost. Survivors clung to life rafts as the U-boats prowled the debris fields, surfacing briefly to finish off crippled ships with their deck guns. Yet amid this slaughter, the greatest enigma was the disappearance of those 7 ships, unrecorded, unclaimed, and unrecovered. Some believe they had been destroyed so completely that no trace remained. Others whispered darker theories, that navigational interference had driven them hundreds of miles off course, into waters where no one searched. Either way, the official reports could offer only one explanation: lost at sea, cause unknown. In the cold logic of war, those words were final. But for the intelligence community, they marked the beginning of a puzzle that demanded answers. Somewhere in the encrypted silence between Bletchley Park and the bottom of the Atlantic lay the truth, one that could change how the Battle of the Atlantic was understood forever. As 1943 ground on, Britain's survival hung by a thread, and the Allies faced a haunting question. If the sea could swallow 7 ships without a trace, what else might it be hiding? The next chapter would bring them closer to that answer, but only by following the ghosts of HX 229 into the heart of the storm. By the third night of battle, the North Atlantic had become a vision of hell. The storm clouds hung low, the waves rose like black walls, and the sea itself seemed to burn. Fires from torpedoed ships lit the sky, reflected in the oil-slick water as survivors clung to floating wreckage. Between March 16th and 18th, the men of Convoy HX 229 fought not only the enemy, but the ocean itself, a chaos of explosions, screams, and freezing spray. Those who lived through it would later say the darkness had sound, a deep, roaring chorus of wind, steel, and human desperation. The merchant sailors, many of them civilians with minimal training, were the lifeline of the war. Aboard ships like the Silver Maple, Moore, and Narva, crews worked around the clock to keep engines running and fires under control. They had no armor, no weapons beyond a single deck gun, and no protection against torpedoes that struck without warning. At 2:47 a.m. on March 17th, the freighter Narva took 2 hits amidships. Within minutes, aviation fuel ignited, sending a column of flame hundreds of feet into the air. It was like daylight, one survivor recalled, and in that light, we saw other ships sinking all around us. On the bridge of HMS Duncan, Captain Peter Gretton struggled to maintain order. His sonar crew reported multiple contacts, but every time they dropped depth charges, they found nothing. The Germans were everywhere and nowhere, moving unseen beneath the waves. Gretton made a grim decision. The escort group would stay to defend the convoy rather than chase U-boats. "We save who we can," he told his officers, "but we cannot save everyone." Those words would haunt him for the rest of his life. The weather turned against them. A freezing gale swept in from the northwest, breaking up lifeboats and scattering debris. The corvette Penawart rescued a dozen men from the Port Auckland, their skin blackened by oil and frostbite. They had no faces left, only eyes, one sailor later said. The convoy's formation collapsed as captains steered blindly through the smoke and fog. Ships became separated, straying from the protection of the escorts, and into the waiting jaws of the wolf pack. By dawn on March 18th, the battle was over. The sea was calm again, eerily so. HMS Vimy and USS Upshur circled the debris fields, calling on shortwave radio for survivors. The air stank of diesel and death. Out of 49 merchant ships, more than 20 were gone. But even as the survivors were tallied, confusion spread through the ranks. The numbers didn't add up. 7 ships were missing. Not sunk, not adrift, simply missing. Lieutenant Harold Fraser noted in his log, "Our signals show no last transmission. No sighting. It's as though they sailed into a different sea entirely." The missing ships included the Silver Maple, Moore, Wellington Star, and Calling Spy. None had sent a distress call. Their last reported position placed them near the convoy center, precisely where protection was strongest. Yet when the smoke cleared, they were gone. No wreckage, no survivors, no oil slicks. The Royal Navy's immediate assumption was that they had exploded and sunk without trace. But the captains of nearby vessels insisted they had seen no such explosions. When the surviving escorts reached St. John's, Newfoundland, the Admiralty launched a formal inquiry. Investigators pored over the convoy logs, comparing radio traffic, signal patterns, and weather data. What they found deepened the mystery. Several ships' navigational readings were inconsistent, bearings off by as much as 20 degrees. Compass interference, perhaps, or radio jamming. The theory was dismissed at the time, but in hindsight, it may have been the first clue. In a letter to his wife, one surviving officer wrote, "It wasn't just the Germans. Something was wrong with the instruments. The compass spun, the radar blinked, and then silence. As if we'd slipped off the edge of the world." It was easy for London to bury such stories amid the chaos of war. Official communiques focused on the heroism of the escort crews, not the unexplained disappearances. To admit uncertainty was to admit weakness. Yet among the surviving sailors, the question never went away. How could 7 ships, traveling in formation and under escort, vanish completely in a single night? As spring 1943 unfolded, whispers began circulating through the merchant fleet. Some claimed the missing ships had been diverted by false signals, lured into enemy waters. Others said they had drifted far north, into the ice. A few believed they were still out there, adrift and unreported. But no one could prove anything. The Atlantic had swallowed its evidence whole. For historians, HX 229 became a case study in chaos, an example of how fragile convoy coordination could be under pressure. But for the families of the missing sailors, it became something else entirely, a wound without closure. The war would move on, the convoys would continue, but the mystery of those 7 ships would remain. As one report concluded with haunting brevity, vessels presumed lost, cause undetermined. The phrase would echo through the records of the Admiralty for years to come, and it would drive a new wave of investigation, one that would uncover secrets the war's victors had long kept buried beneath layers of classification. Because somewhere beneath the cold Atlantic, evidence still waited, proof of what really happened during the night the convoy disappeared. In the weeks following the disappearance of the 7 ships from Convoy HX 229, the Admiralty found itself facing a troubling puzzle. Officially, the losses were attributed to U-boat attacks. Unofficially, a handful of officers and intelligence analysts weren't so sure. The evidence didn't fit the usual pattern. There were no confirmed torpedo strikes, no intercepted Enigma messages claiming the kills, and no wreckage found along the projected routes. The missing ships had simply ceased to exist. Inside London's Admiralty building, a small team from the Naval Intelligence Division began piecing together a quiet investigation, headed by Commander Ian Fleming, then an assistant to the Director of Naval Intelligence, and later the creator of James Bond. The inquiry sought to determine whether Germany had developed a new, undisclosed form of naval deception. The team's first stop, Bletchley Park. At Bletchley, the codebreakers were struggling to regain access to the German Triton cipher. For months, the U-boat fleet's communications had been unreadable, leaving Allied convoys sailing blind. But among the few fragments of intercepted traffic that had been partially reconstructed, one repeated term caught their attention: Täuschung, the German word for deception. The term appeared in reference to a series of operations coordinated by Wolfpack Raubgraf, the very group that had attacked HX 229. The fragments hinted at something unusual, a form of electronic warfare, involving the transmission of false navigational beacons and radar signals. Though unproven, It suggested that the Germans had begun using decoy transmissions to mislead Allied ships. If true, it meant that the U-boats had weaponized confusion itself. To test the theory, the Admiralty called in reports from surviving convoy commanders. Captain Peter Gretton of HMS Duncan described how his radar had suffered unexplained interference during the engagement, flickering ghosts on the screen, as though false echoes were being generated. The operator who manned the set swore that the interference had a deliberate rhythm, like someone tapping a Morse key underwater. Similar accounts arrived from other escort ships. Yet with no physical evidence, the reports were filed away as anomalies. Still, a pattern began to emerge. Intelligence officers found that several convoys, not just HX-229, had reported similar electronic disturbances in early 1943. HMS Snowflake and Vedette, escorting Convoy SC-122 that same week, recorded compass deviations of over 15 degrees. And in both cases, the U-boats had struck with uncanny precision, as though their prey had been lured directly into their path. One internal memo from the time, long classified and later declassified in 1986, stated bluntly, "It is possible the enemy is conducting experiments in radio deception. They appear to generate false signals imitating convoy navigation frequencies, perhaps to distort direction-finding bearings." But the idea of radio deception seemed too advanced for 1943. The technology to transmit and jam radar at long range was still in its infancy. Many dismissed the theory as an overreaction born from wartime stress. Commander Fleming, however, was not convinced. In a note to his superior, Rear Admiral John Godfrey, he wrote, "It would not be the first time the Germans have turned our own confidence against us. They may not need to sink every ship, only to confuse our navigators long enough for the sea to do the rest." Meanwhile, the surviving crews of HX-229 were being quietly debriefed at the Royal Naval Hospital in Greenock, Scotland. One officer from the merchant ship Moore recalled that before radio contact was lost, his compass had begun spinning uncontrollably, followed by a sudden burst of static across every frequency. "It was like the world went off its axis," he said, "and then nothing, just silence." The Admiralty's investigation soon hit a wall. Every lead circled back to the same problem. The missing ships lay somewhere beneath 2 miles of ocean, and wartime priorities had moved on. The Battle of the Atlantic was still raging, and the resources for deep-sea investigation simply didn't exist. Officially, the matter was closed in late 1944, buried under a classification seal marked Operational Anomalies. No further inquiry. For decades, that file remained forgotten. Until the 1970s, when British naval historian Dr. Peter Kemp stumbled upon references to electronic deception tactics in declassified Admiralty papers. His research suggested that the Germans had indeed tested radar-reflective decoys known as Aphrodite buoys, designed to mimic ships on radar. If deployed near a convoy's route, these could easily lead escorts astray. The U-boats could then attack from unexpected angles, or allow the convoy to scatter into isolated groups. In such confusion, entire ships could vanish without a trace. Modern naval analysts now believe this is precisely what happened to part of HX-229. Under cover of bad weather and deliberate signal interference, the convoy center ships were misled into an area outside the protection of the escort screen, where they were quietly picked off by waiting U-boats, their remains lost in the deep. But even this explanation fails to account for everything. Why was there no trace of oil or debris? Why no intercepted reports claiming the kills? The Germans meticulously logged their victories, yet Rob Graff's own records, recovered after the war, make no mention of 7 additional sinkings that night. The mystery endures, part deception, part disappearance. Whether the lost ships of HX-229 fell victim to German ingenuity, navigational chaos, or nature's fury, no one can say with certainty. What remains is the unsettling truth that in modern warfare, invisibility need not be supernatural. It can be engineered. And as the 20th century marched forward into an era of electronic warfare and misinformation, the lesson of HX-229 would echo across generations. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon in war is not what destroys your enemy, but what blinds them to what's real. As the Admiralty's last secret memos faded into archival dust, the sea still kept its silence. But decades later, a new kind of exploration would try to break it. One that would send divers deep into the cold Atlantic, searching for answers buried under 80 years of secrecy. 50 years after Convoy HX 229 vanished into the cold Atlantic, technology finally made the impossible possible. In the summer of 1993, a joint British-American maritime research team, led by historian and former Royal Navy diver Dr. Andrew Latham, launched Operation Grey Silence, an expedition to locate the wrecks of the missing ships. Funded in part by the Imperial War Museum and NOAA, their goal was simple: to close one of the longest-standing mysteries of the Battle of the Atlantic. Using side-scan sonar and deep-sea remotely operated vehicles, Latham's team began sweeping the seabed along the convoy's recorded route between Newfoundland and Ireland. At first, they found what everyone expected: twisted steel, scattered debris, and the shattered remnants of merchant vessels already known to have been sunk. But then, 300 miles northeast of the expected debris field, the sonar revealed something startling. 3 large objects lying close together, far outside any documented search area. At depths exceeding 4,000 meters, they discovered what appeared to be the remains of the Silver Maple, more, and another ship yet to be identified. Their locations made no sense. They were hundreds of miles off their plotted course, as if they had sailed straight into the open Atlantic, away from their escorts and convoy formation. Latham described the moment in his log. The instruments said one thing, the charts said another. It was as though the sea had moved them, or misled them, into a place they were never meant to be. Further dives over the following weeks revealed a disturbing pattern. The ships appeared intact, with no signs of explosion or torpedo damage. Hatches were closed, cargo still sealed. One vessel's bridge telegraph was frozen at full ahead, and the compass was found still mounted, its glass cracked but the needle locked hard east, pointing several degrees off true north. Compass gone mad. God help us, read a waterlogged scrap of paper found near the helm of the Moore's wreck. When news of the discovery reached the surface, historians and naval engineers were baffled. How could fully loaded merchant ships have drifted that far without distress signals or signs of combat? Ocean currents couldn't explain it, nor could navigational error alone. The ships had apparently steamed willingly, under power, straight off course, into the void. Dr. Latham's team sent samples of the Moore's radio equipment to the University of Southampton for analysis. The results were inconclusive, but one anomaly stood out. The radio tuning coils were burned out, as if they had been subjected to a sudden surge of electromagnetic interference. This matched wartime reports from surviving ships of HX 229, who described sudden static and blank radar screens just before their companions disappeared. For the first time in 50 years, a thread of the old false signal theory seemed to have materialized. Meanwhile, naval records declassified in the early 1990s shed new light on German experimental technology. Among them were references to a device known as Thetis, used briefly by U-boat flotillas in 1943. It was designed to broadcast fake radar signals to confuse Allied detection systems. While intended to conceal submarines, historians now suspect it might also have been capable of interfering with shipborne navigation, creating the illusion of false bearings that could lure vessels off course. But the implications were staggering. If Thetis or a similar device was deployed during the Raugraff operations, the Germans may have stumbled onto one of the earliest forms of electronic warfare. HX 229's missing ships might have been the first victims of what we now call signal spoofing. Not everyone accepted the theory. Some scientists argued that magnetic anomalies caused by iron-rich seabed formations might have affected compasses and radios. Others pointed to psychological strain, the confusion of night battle and bad weather. In the chaos of war, wrote one historian, truth often drowns faster than ships. Yet the wrecks told their own silent story. The positioning of lifeboat davits suggested that no evacuation was attempted. The ships went down fast, or perhaps not at all in the usual sense. They seemed to have drifted, engines running, until fuel exhaustion or flooding sealed their fate. Whatever happened aboard those decks in March 1943, it was swift and bewildering enough to leave no time for distress calls. One photograph from the expedition showed a striking image. The Silver Maples Bridge, eerily preserved in the deep, the helm was still upright, a mug resting beside it. It became an icon for the lost convoy, a snapshot of war's quiet mysteries. Dr. Latham concluded his expedition report with words that would resonate with naval historians for decades. "We have found the bodies, but not the cause. These ships did not sink in battle. They wandered, lost to a war that bent the limits of human understanding." Operation Gray Silence brought answers, but also deeper questions. Could wartime deception truly have redirected entire vessels? Or had the Atlantic itself played its own cruel trick, masking its secrets in magnetic storms and silence? Whatever the truth, the find reignited public fascination with HX 229. Documentaries, naval studies, and memorials followed. Families who had waited generations finally had graves to mourn, but still no certainty about what had taken their loved ones. And as one American survivor, then 91 years old, remarked in a BBC interview, "We thought the enemy was beneath us. Turns out, the real enemy might have been the signals we trusted." The final chapter of the story would seek closure, or at least meaning, in the enduring silence of the sea. Because even after wrecks were found and theories proposed, one fact remained unchanged. The Atlantic still kept its secrets. 80 years after the night Convoy HX 229 vanished, the Atlantic remains as silent as ever. The waves roll endlessly over the resting places of ships that once carried Britain's lifeline. Steel hulls turn to ghosts beneath the sea. What began as a wartime mystery has grown into one of history's most haunting enigmas. Not a story of supernatural forces, but of technology, confusion, and the fragility of human understanding in the face of chaos. Today, historians and maritime archaeologists still debate what truly happened during those fateful March nights of 1943. Some argue the lost ships succumbed to mechanical failure amid confusion, damage from near misses, or faulty instruments. Others remain convinced that the Germans' experimental deception systems, such as the Thetis and radar-reflective Aphrodite buoys, interfered with Allied navigation more effectively than anyone realized at the time. The truth, as always in war, may lie somewhere between human error and human ingenuity. Forensic analysis of the wrecks in the 2000s provided more clues, but no closure. Marine corrosion patterns suggested that the vessels did not explode or break apart violently. Instead, they appear to have flooded evenly, as though their crews were unaware of danger until the very end. Subtle scoring on the hulls indicated prolonged drifting, perhaps hundreds of miles, before finally succumbing to the sea. It painted a chilling picture. Ships steaming into the void, their compasses unreliable, their radios dead, their captains certain they were still within the convoy. Naval historians, such as Dr. Eleanor Shaw of King's College London, see in HX 229 a lesson in over-reliance on technology. The Allies trusted their instruments completely, she wrote. But in 1943, the instruments themselves were under attack. It was the dawn of a new battlefield, one where truth could be distorted by the push of a switch. Her research linked the convoy's navigational anomalies to similar reports from the Arctic convoys to Murmansk, suggesting the Germans were already testing the boundaries of electronic deception across multiple theaters. The modern Royal Navy has since drawn direct parallels between HX 229 and contemporary threats in electronic warfare. In naval training schools today, cadets study the case as an early example of signal spoofing, a tactic now recognized in cyber and drone warfare alike. The lesson is clear. The most dangerous weapon is not always a torpedo or a missile. It's the manipulation of perception. The ghost ships of HX 229 became the first known casualties of that invisible front. Yet, even with modern understanding, mystery lingers. The last dive to the Silver Maples wreck in 2018 revealed something extraordinary. Mounted near the bridge was a damaged signal transmitter, its coils fused in place, as if frozen mid-transmission. The final message, partially decoded by technicians, was a fragment of Morse code, bearing lost, course unknown. The message was never received during the war. It was discovered 75 years too late. For the families of the 390 sailors who never returned, the story's ending offers little comfort. Memorial plaques in Liverpool and Halifax list their names under the same cold inscription: Lost at Sea, Cause Unknown. Each year, on the anniversary of the convoy's departure, a wreath is cast into the Atlantic by surviving relatives and naval officers. The sea gives nothing back, but the gesture endures, a conversation with history, carried by the wind. Captain Peter Gretton, who survived the battle and later became an admiral, once wrote, "The sea has no memory. Only we remember, and that is our duty." His words capture what remains of HX 229's legacy, a story not just of loss, but of persistence, courage, and the price of innovation. In the end, perhaps the greatest mystery is not how the ships disappeared, but why the truth remains elusive even now. The wrecks lie silent, their instruments corroded, their secrets sealed in salt and time. But in their stillness, they whisper a warning that echoes across generations. When war blinds men with their own technology, the ocean needs no enemy to claim its toll. As the camera fades from the cold, gray waves of the North Atlantic, the narrator's final words carry the weight of 80 years of unanswered questions. The lost convoy has been found, but its story is not yet finished. Because the sea remembers what history forgets. And with that, the chronicle of HX 229 closes, not with certainty, but with reverence, as the Atlantic swallows the last echoes of a war fought in silence.